A Chinese student who looked down upon America and boldly declared, "China leads the world in dealing with racism" in the lecture hall, was completely refuted by Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. He left the student speechless. Donald Trump was invited by a university in the United States as a guest speaker. He explained to the students that the United States is currently leading in racism elimination. At that moment, a Chinese female student unexpectedly objected and declared, "China is the leading country in the world in racism elimination. America is nothing compared to China." A fierce debate ensued, and the Chinese student who harbored resentment towards the US was completely refuted by Trump. What happened here? Let's delve deeper into the matter now. Before diving into the main content of the video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive updates on the latest videos from our channel. Leave your comments to give us feedback on the content and any other topics you're interested in. Your support means a lot to us. Have a great day. Hello, my name is David. Currently, I am a student majoring in humanities at the University of Alabama, USA. My university often invites professors and famous people from all over the world to give lectures and interact with students. Recently, my school invited Donald Trump to interact with students. This exchange is open, meaning that not only students of the humanities department can participate, but students from other departments can also register to attend if they like. According to the information I know, Donald Trump attended Fordham University for 2 years before transferring to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in economics. While Donald Trump's career has indeed primarily revolved around business, real estate, and politics, it's important to clarify that his stance on racism and his efforts related to anti-racism have been a subject of considerable debate and controversy. For that reason, Trump naturally knows very well about racism and issues related to it. At the beginning of the exchange, Trump said, "History repeats itself. We must learn from our own mistakes. Experience is inevitable to make us better." How many times have we heard these idioms? But in fact, in today's highly connected world, we also benefit from learning and absorbing lessons and good practices from others. When we students were confused and didn't understand what he meant, he continued to ask a question. In your opinion, which is the country leading in preparing to respond to racism and make a positive contribution in transmitting their experiences to the world? We students answered his question with many different opinions. Most of the countries mentioned were in the West, such as the UK, France, Germany. Trump nodded gently to us, and he said that all the answers had reasonable points, but were not completely accurate. When no one else came up with ideas, he said the perfect answer would be America. America is no stranger to racism, with a long and complex history deeply rooted in systemic discrimination and prejudice against various racial and ethnic groups. From the era of slavery and segregation to ongoing disparities in areas such as education, employment, housing, and criminal justice, the legacy of racism continues to shape the social, economic, and political landscape of the country. Trump explained, "The US is a country that has experienced many cases of racism, and while living in such an environment, they have become one of the most prepared countries on earth. But what is most notable is the US's generosity in helping other countries fighting racism so they do not suffer the same fate." At this time, a Chinese student raised his hand and asked a question. "Why are you sure the US is the best in the world at this? I see that China also faces a lot of racism due to its large population and variety of ethnicity. Furthermore, China's population is still the largest in the world, proving that China is doing better than the US." Mr. Trump began his analysis. When you compare the number of cases of racism that happened in the US, plus the population density, and compare it with the death rate, the numbers are really surprisingly small. According to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, there were 7,314 hate crime incidents reported in the United States in 2019. In terms of population density, as of 2020, the United States had an estimated population of approximately 331 million people spread across a vast land area of about 3.8 million square miles. That means hate crime rate per capita was approximately 2.21 incidents per 100,000 people in the United States. That is a very small number, proving that the US has prevented racism very well. In contrast, in China, the number of discrimination cases is not as frequent and strong as in the US, yet racism in China often causes death, 60% more than the US. Ethnic minorities such as Uyghurs, Tibetans often suffer from racial discrimination and violence. A large population does not prove that China is safe. Furthermore, China's vast population does not mean that China experiences more racism than the US. I guess you are not a humanities student because those who study humanities know that racism is caused by historical injustices, colonialism, slavery, segregation, and other forms of oppression that have created enduring social, economic, and political inequalities between racial and ethnic groups. China has not gone through such a thing. Trump's analysis quickly convinced us that is the basic knowledge we have to learn in this industry. Then Trump frankly and firmly said to the Chinese student, "The last racism case in the US took place in 2020. This was also a bad and violent one. It was a heartbreaking event in our country, but the Americans have risen from pain. This devastating event led to a paradigm shift in racism management policies in the country, especially around big states." Most of us agreed with his words, but the Chinese student seemed to have doubts about his words and was openly dissatisfied with his statement. The Chinese student clearly expressed his anti-US attitude when asking Mr. Trump a question. Even so, what has the US done to be praised as a leading country in preparing to respond to racism? I feel your comments are very one-sided. If you want to confirm that your statement is true, please prove it. The request posed by the Chinese student surprised other students like me. After that, the Chinese student continued, saying that he could not understand how a president like Trump could praise the US so excessively. That shocked the other students. It was an act of disrespect towards the president, and Mr. Trump would probably be angry. But he was very calm and gave a friendly smile before answering the Chinese student's question. Mr. Trump turned to us students and started talking. One significant area where my administration made strides in addressing racial disparities is criminal justice reform. The passage of the First Step Act in December 2018 was a landmark bipartisan achievement aimed at reducing mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenses, expanding rehabilitative programs for inmates, and promoting re-entry initiatives for those leaving prison. Supporters argue that this legislation has helped to mitigate the disproportionate impact of harsh sentencing laws on communities of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanics. Additionally, my administration established the Federal Interagency Council on Crime Prevention and Improving Re-Entry to coordinate efforts across agencies to reduce recidivism and support successful reintegration into society for formerly incarcerated individuals. These measures are seen by some as positive steps towards addressing systemic injustices within the criminal justice system and promoting rehabilitation over punitive measures. By the Trump administration as a means of combating racial inequality is the Opportunity Zones program. Established as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, this program aims to incentivize private investment in economically distressed areas by providing tax benefits to investors. Supporters argue that opportunity zones have the potential to spur economic development, create jobs, and improve living conditions in communities that have historically been marginalized and underserved, including many predominantly minority neighborhoods. While the effectiveness of opportunity zones in reducing poverty and revitalizing distressed communities remains a subject of debate, some proponents view them as a proactive measure to address economic disparities and promote inclusive growth. When the Chinese students could not deny that truth, Trump continued to show another video about China. He said, "One area where concerns about discrimination have been raised in China is in relation to treatment of ethnic minority groups, particularly Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim populations in the Xinjiang region." Reports from human rights organizations and news outlets have documented allegations of widespread human rights abuses, including mass arbitrary detention, forced labor, cultural suppression, and surveillance targeting these communities. While the Chinese government denies these allegations and describes its actions in Xinjiang as necessary measures to combat terrorism and extremism, critics argue that they constitute violations of basic human rights and may be motivated by ethnic and religious discrimination. Additionally, there have been incidents of racism and discrimination targeting foreigners, particularly individuals of African descent, in China. Reports of discriminatory practices in housing, employment, and public spaces have drawn attention to the challenges faced by foreign residents and visitors from minority backgrounds in China. These incidents have sparked debate and calls for greater awareness and action to address racism and xenophobia within Chinese society. We feel it is a very fair assessment and explanation coming from Mr. Trump. Meanwhile, the Chinese student could not hide his shock. He still tried to regain their honor. What's so good about just that? Anyway, that's not enough to say the US is better than China in dealing with racism. Trump continued, addressing the consequences of racism in China can indeed present unique challenges compared to the United States due to differences in social, cultural, and political contexts. While both countries grapple with issues of discrimination and prejudice, the consequences of racism in China may manifest in distinct ways with varying impacts on affected individuals and communities. One significant difference between China and the United States is the level of government control over information and discourse. In China, the government tightly controls media, online platforms, and public discourse through censorship and surveillance mechanisms. As a result, incidents of racism and discrimination may be underreported or suppressed, making it difficult for affected individuals to raise awareness or seek redress for injustices. China's legal framework for addressing discrimination is less developed compared to Western democracies like the United States. While China has laws prohibiting discrimination based on ethnicity and nationality, enforcement mechanisms and legal remedies may be limited, and there may be gaps in protection for marginalized groups, including ethnic minorities and foreigners. Victims of racism in China, particularly ethnic minorities and foreigners, may face social stigma, marginalization, and exclusion from mainstream society. Discriminatory attitudes and stereotypes can impact individuals' access to education, employment, housing, healthcare, and other essential services, exacerbating socioeconomic disparities and hindering social mobility. I used to think that racism was an unavoidable part of society. Growing up as a person of color in America, I had experienced firsthand the discrimination and prejudice that existed within our country. It wasn't until I witnessed the rise of Donald Trump as the President of the United States that I began to question my beliefs. At first, I was skeptical of Trump's promises to eliminate racism. As a businessman with no political background, I couldn't see how he would be able to address such a deep-rooted issue in our society. But as he took office and started implementing his policies, I began to see a shift in the way people perceived race. One of the first steps that Trump took to combat racism was through education. He believed that in order to tackle the issue, we needed to start with our youth. He launched a nationwide campaign to promote diversity and acceptance in schools. This included incorporating lessons on racial equality in the curriculum and organizing workshops for students to engage in open dialogue about race. I was amazed by the impact this had on the younger generation. I saw kids who were once taught to discriminate based on skin color, now embracing their classmates of different races and cultures. The school playgrounds, which were once segregated, were now filled with children playing and laughing together. It was a beautiful sight to see. But Trump didn't stop there. He also implemented policies to provide equal opportunities for all races in the workforce. This meant that companies were required to have a diverse workforce and ensure equal pay for employees of different races. It was a bold move, but it proved to be effective in breaking down the barriers that kept people of color from succeeding in their careers. I remember one incident where I applied for a job at a prestigious company and was turned down because of my race. But after Trump's policies were implemented, the same company reached out to me for an interview. Not only did I get the job, but I also saw more and more people of color being hired at the company. It was a refreshing change to see diversity in the workplace. But perhaps the most impactful move that Trump made to eliminate racism was through his immigration policies. He believed that by securing our country's borders and cracking down on illegal immigration, we could prevent the influx of drugs and crime that disproportionately affected minority communities. This was a controversial decision, but it ultimately proved to be beneficial in reducing crime rates and creating a safer environment for all races to thrive. However, Trump's immigration policies weren't only focused on keeping people out. He also prioritized helping legal immigrants and refugees who were coming into our country. He implemented programs to help immigrants assimilate into American society and provided resources for them to learn English and acquire job skills. This not only helped them succeed in their new home, but also contributed to the diversity and inclusivity of our country. As time went on, I saw significant changes in the attitudes and behaviors of people around me. The once divided and racially tense communities were now more integrated and accepting. People were starting to judge each other based on their character and actions rather than their race or ethnicity. It was a transformation that I never thought possible before. But the biggest change I witnessed was within myself. I had grown up with a deep mistrust of white people due to the discrimination I faced. But as Trump's policies began to break down the racial barriers, I found myself embracing people of all races and cultures. I realized that my previous prejudices were a defense mechanism, and that I had been wrong to judge an entire group of people based on the actions of a few. Looking back now, I'm amazed at the progress our country has made in eliminating racism. It's not to say that it doesn't exist at all, but it has significantly reduced thanks to the bold and controversial actions of President Trump. He proved that by taking a strong stance and implementing effective policies, we can create a more inclusive and accepting society. I still can't believe that a businessman with no political background was able to achieve what so many leaders before him failed to do. But I am grateful for his determination and courage to address the issue of racism head-on. Thanks to him, I can now confidently say that I am proud to be an American regardless of my race.